Whew. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll still gather a few people here. Helen was just telling me she read The Gift of the Magi for the first time. Does anybody else remember the O. Henry story? The Gifts of the Magi, actually gift, singular, of the Magi. And we're going to talk about what a Magi is here in a little bit. Google actually says it's pronounced Magi, but the English pronounce it Maggie. So, English pronunciation, yeah.
They also pronounce the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, as Chihuahua.
Yeah. And Don Juan instead of Don Juan. Yeah, that English. Yeah. All right, so David asked me, he said, well, would you rather do the Magi or the Shepherds? And I said, I'd rather do O. Henry than Charlie Brown's Christmas. So next week you get Charlie Brown's Christmas. And if you remember the O. Henry story, this is a spoiler alert. There's a young couple very much in love. Each of them has one thing that they treasure more than anything in life. He has a magnificent pocket watch that he got from his grandfather. And it's just it is gold, it is everything. Right? And she has the most glorious long hair of any woman in the world. And she's proud of her hair, but she was getting ready for Christmas and she had $1.23 in her pocket. Half of that was in pennies that she had saved day after day after day. And what am I going to do for Jim's Christmas? Finally, she said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go cut my hair and I'm going to sell my hair. And that's what they did in those days. So she cut her hair and got $20 and went out and bought the most gorgeous watch fob for Jim's magnificent watch. So he comes home, he sees her short hair, he just sits down there stunned because he had sold his watch to buy her some hair combs. All right. That's the twist at the end, but it's sad but sweet, and it's just that's kind of takes, and at the very end it says the gifts of the Magi. We're kind of we're going to get into that. Okay. In fact, we're going to start. I'm going to read the entire story. Okay, so you can follow along if you want to. I will try to read it in a way that will keep your attention. Matthew chapter 2. This story only appears in Matthew. Only in Matthew. Now, keep thinking in your head about, oh, I didn't realize that was in there. Or keep thinking in your head, we don't usually read this whole story. And I'm going to warn you, this story ends in what I think is the ugliest passage in the New Testament. It's what is called the slaughter of the innocents. Okay, so be forewarned. But starting with chapter 2, verse 1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is shepherd to my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage. When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, They left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Go, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, Out of Egypt I have called my son. And when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated. And he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. That's a bad ending. All right, we're going to stop right there. And I'm going to ask some questions. Okay, so how many were there? How many wise men were there? It doesn't say, does it? Why do we always say there's 3? Because there's 3 gifts. That's the only indication. We know there's more than one because magi is the plural of magus. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. What were their names? Don't know. Don't know how many. Don't know. Traditionally, they've got names called Gaspar or Caspar, who is often said to be a young man from Asia, and Melchior, often said to be an old king from Europe, and Balthazar, often said to be a middle-aged man from Africa. So in that way, and again, this is Christian legend, that way the whole world is represented coming to pay homage to Jesus. You've got Europe and Asia and Africa all coming together to pay homage. Okay. So what's a magus anyway? That's a singular of magi. What do you think it means? M-A-G, what else would you put on there? Magician. Okay, so there is another magus in the New Testament, actually two magi in the book of Acts. One of them we usually refer to as Simon the sorcerer, but we never talk about the 3 sorcerers, but it's the same word. Okay, Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8. And fun fact, all right, so Simon is the one who was a magician, kind of made his living at it. And when Philip came through, it was in Samaria, I believe, and Philip came through and he converted to Christianity. And then Peter and John came through, touching people and healing them and granting the Holy Spirit. And Simon went up to Peter and says, I've got some money. I'd like to be able to do that. How much would it cost me to have the same power that you have? And Peter basically cursed him. And wrong thing to ask. And I haven't heard this word used in common conversation a long time, but the name Simon is the source of the word simony, which is a grievous sin in the Catholic Church of people who are buying church offices. If you bought a church office, you would be guilty of simony. And that word comes from Simon the sorcerer, Simon the magi. All right. There's another sorcerer, magi, in Elymas the magician is Acts 13, but that's another one. Okay, so where did they come from? Where did the magi come from? Back in Matthew. The East. Whatever that means, the East. Now, if we talk about the East, we might talk about New York City. When they talked about the East, they talked about Persia and Mesopotamia and, kind of the civilizations over there. And in fact, that part of the world was really big into astrology, and there wasn't really much difference between astrology and astronomy in those days. So it would not be unexpected for somebody from that part of the world to be watching for stars and be watching for messages coming from the heavens. Okay, so that's kind of the feel you get for this, is that now, How come they got, why they got that message? Don't know. That's going to be a question for you guys. Okay. Okay, so what about those gifts? Now, these are the first Christmas gifts in the history of the world, by the way. All right. And gold. Okay, that's a good one. We'd still like to have that. I mean, that's the equivalent of an Amazon card, right? So, but gold was the metal of kings. So with gold, the idea is that recognizing him as the text said, the King of the Jews. So that's what the gold represented. Okay, frankincense. Again, it's been a long time since I've got frankincense in my stocking. Frankincense was an incense and ointment that was mostly associated with priestly worship. It's mentioned in, where did I say? It's mentioned in Exodus 30. It's mentioned in Leviticus 2, kind of associated with sacrifices. How about myrrh? Myrrh. A word with no vowels, basically. Myrrh. Myrrh is associated with burials, with preparing bodies for the tomb. In Matthew, later on in Matthew, we see, let me actually read what I've got instead of just making it up. Okay, mostly associated with preparing dead bodies. So Nicodemus, as he was taking the body of Jesus, bought 75 pounds of aloes and myrrh to wrap Jesus in. When Jesus said, I thirst, somebody got some sour wine and mixed it with myrrh and held it up for him to drink, and he said no. So myrrh is associated, and that's kind of where we're going here in this class. It would be kind of like giving a baby today a deed to a cemetery plot. I mean, it's bizarre and it's strange, but one of my arguments here is we've got a number of foreshadowings of the cross in this story, more so than we do probably next week's story. Okay, another question I was going to ask: how old was Jesus when they made their visit? We don't. Easy answer is we don't know. But what can we say? Did they come to the manger? Okay, where did they come to? They came to a house. And it's interestingly, they went in the house and saw Mary and the child. So where was Joseph? Is he at work? I mean, they were, at least it was in a house. Now, did you notice when I read the text, how many times, twice, Herod paid really close attention to when exactly did this happen? Twice it said he called the Magi secretly and found out exactly when they first saw the star. And then when he gave his order to kill the children, he based his order on the time that the Magi had told him. And how many children, what age children did he target? 0 to 2. So he must have had some reason to think. I'm kind of thinking 1. Jesus was probably 1 because that would split the difference and be an average and be, ugly. Okay. But it does not sound like he was a newborn for several reasons. Let's talk about Herod for a little bit. I'm going to put his dates down here. This is Herod the Great. He may not seem great in this story. I'll put 73 BC through 4 BC. Okay. Do you notice anything surprising about those dates? No, I mean 4 BC.
Then that's what I find.
Okay. All right. So if Jesus was born on year 1, Herod had been dead for 4 years. Okay? And this exactly is the reason why most scholars put the birth of Jesus is between 4 and 7 BC. People in those days, they didn't have they didn't have a birth certificate. They didn't keep track of time like we do now. So, and somebody asked me, well, how did they keep time? They didn't say BC. Well, they kept time by saying in the year such and such of so and so's reign. In the 13th year of the reign of Caesar Augustus, or something like that. And we see that all the way through Old and New Testament. But anyway, Herod the Great, he had a long history with Rome. He was an Idumean, which is like an Edomite. His family had converted to Judaism some time back, so he was, according to the Senate of Rome, he was the king of the Jews, or the king of Judea, which kind of means the same thing. And so he is probably the worst person in the world for the Magi to come up to and say, where is he who is born king of the Jews? And that's why Herod was frightened. And when Herod gets frightened, all Jerusalem gets frightened. Herod killed several of his sons who he thought were trying to usurp him, and one wife at least. There was a one-liner about Herod, and this Herod, that supposedly was made by Augustus, but was probably not. But the one-liner goes, it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Because he killed his sons. But as a good Jew, he would never eat a pig. All right. I mean, just even thinking that, do you know anybody that is just really strictly scrupulous about the ceremonial and the ritual, but when it gets time to treating real people like animals, that was Herod. That was Herod. Herod's famous as a builder. He rebuilt the Jerusalem temple. And I say that, okay, I used to wonder, so historians refer to this period of Judaism as Second Temple Judaism. If you look up Second Temple Judaism, First Temple Judaism would be the Temple of Solomon that was destroyed by the Babylonians. 570, something like that, whatever. And then the Second Temple was rebuilt by Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, when they came back from Persia. And I always said, well, why isn't this third temple? Because I know Herod built the temple too. Well, he just kind of did an overlay of in other words, the second temple was never destroyed. It was just kind of covered up with Herod's huge palace. And that's why even in the Gospels, as they're walking in the temple in the last week of his life, they're pointing out to him how magnificent these buildings are. And Jesus says, the time is coming when there's not going to be one stone left on another. Or destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. It was Herod's temple they're talking about. So that's still the same temple that Zerubbabel's Nehemiah built. Okay, let's talk about foreshadowing. The first foreshadowing I see, and please ask me questions. This story has got a lot more in it than we see in our Christmas, our Christmas stories. So the first foreshadowing I see is when they come to Herod and say, where is he who is born King of the Jews? Where have we heard that before? We heard it. It was on the cross. Remember, Pilate put a sign on the cross that said the King of the Jews? Why was Jesus crucified? I think the charge against him, to the extent there was an official charge, was he called himself the King of the Jews. But that comes up over and over again in the crucifixion account. So Pilate's question in Matthew 27:11, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, you've said so, or kind of an ambiguous answer. But that was his question. Are you the king of the Jews? When the soldiers were mocking Jesus in Matthew and Mark and John, hail, king of the Jews. And they were also mocking the Jews, right? Because if the Jews have a king that's about to be crucified, that's the kind of people the Jews are. All right, so they were mocking the Jews. They were also mocking Jesus. But for that to appear at his birth with the Magi, again, and the only other place it shows up in the New Testament is at the cross, or is at his last life, his last words, last days. We can read that and see what's going. We can see the foreshadowing there. And another one that we've already talked about is myrrh. That doesn't look unusual to us, but that was a burial ointment. That would have been creepy. All right? And that was, again, we can read it and see what's going on, but imagine Mary opening the presents and seeing myrrh. Oh, how nice. Thank you very much. I mean, that's...
I wonder too, I'm just thinking about Egyptian pharaohs. They've already got their tomb ready when
yeah.
the pharaoh is born. It's
well, yeah, that's
they saw it as,
yeah.
To me, it seemed like they saw him as he's going to be royal.
Yep.
We want this child to live a life
Mm-hmm.
and will one day be buried. We want to be the ones.
We want to be ready. Yeah.
For that burial as well.
And in some ways, if the gold represents, royalty, maybe frankincense represents divinity in some ways, sacrifice, and the myrrh represents the sacrificial death. I mean, all of those, you can, if you're an English professor, you can go to town with those.
Well, I mean, and you wouldn't right now, the king and queen of England, do they have a certain place they already know they're
Oh
going
yeah,
to be?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so that's always pre-planned
Yeah.
for royalty.
For royalty, yeah.
So it feels like,
and especially royalty that's kind of merges into divinity, which is what definitely the Egyptian pharaohs.
Yeah.
And the emperors of Rome. Yeah, Michael.
So how long was Jesus and his family in Egypt? And if so, would these gifts sustain them as currency?
Yeah, so that's if Herod died in 4 BC, it depends on when Jesus was born. I mean, if scholars say between 4 and 7, David, do you have a definitive answer on that one?
I do not.
Or do you want to make up a definitive answer? Yeah. Okay. So that's the question. What's that? Yeah, well, it could have been a leap year. Yeah. So we don't know. I'm suggesting that he might have been 1 to 2 years old when they went to Egypt. And again, only in Matthew does he go to Egypt. Yeah, Catherine?
Wasn't myrrh also kind of like a cleansing oil, like a pure, like antibacterial, kind of killed all the things?
Yeah.
There's some symbolism there about the purification, not just about the burial, but
Yeah.
also the purification.
It could be. And I saw one place where it said the reason they mixed wine with myrrh and gave him on the cross is because myrrh has a anti-pain kind of, a pain-killing aspect to it. In fact, this particular commentary says that that's why Jesus refused it, because he refused to alleviate any pain. He was taking it all on. So that's maybe that as well. Yeah, Mary?
Kind of what I've heard about the frankincense also. It's kind of a pain reliever. What it's used as.
Maybe it was for Mary and not for Jesus. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Now, okay. So the third, the third, what I'm going to call the foreshadowing, is the slaughter of the innocents themselves. Okay? And when you, that's why I say this is a hard one to talk about. And it struck me the other night as I was working on this, that when Jesus was born, babies died. And in Matthew, and only in Matthew, when Jesus died, saints were raised from the grave. There's a parallel there that I think, again, only in Matthew. Let me read that verse. Matthew 27. Start with 51. 50. And Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tomb and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, you don't hear that preached very often because it's so weird. But if you put that together with the slaughter of the innocents, when Jesus was born, babies died. And when Jesus died, saints were raised from the dead. I mean, it's just kind of a parallel. I don't know what it means. Anybody have any thoughts on that one? How can you put those two together? I mean, and couldn't the Magi have had a dream, said, don't ask Herod that question? I'll show you. Because if you look at the text, it looks like, they saw the star back where they came from. And then when they get to Jerusalem, they don't know where they're going. And then after they leave Jerusalem, they see the star again. So, it appears that star got them started, but then kind of left them. And they had to ask Herod, which caused all the problem. And by the way, I'll mention, you ask about Egypt. In the Matthew story, well, let me read these last few verses I didn't read before. Matthew 2, verse 22, verse 21. No. Oh, go back to 19. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when they heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Okay, so in Matthew's story, what were they doing in Bethlehem? They lived in Bethlehem. And in fact, he even says here, they would have gone back to Bethlehem, but because of Archelaus, they were afraid, so they went and settled in Nazareth. Okay. So, yeah, that's a question. Matthew and Luke, I don't think either of them knew what the other one was doing. So, but that's another question for another day. That's a question to ask David. Yeah.
I have a question for you. So, does that mean Mary and Joseph were not originally from Nazareth?
That's the implication you get in Matthew. So, okay, as I see it, okay, Matthew and Luke each had a problem. They knew Jesus was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, but he was famous as coming from Nazareth. So how do you have him born in Bethlehem and grow up in Nazareth in a society that people never move? Well, in Luke, they have a census. They're living in Nazareth. There's a census. They've got to go to Bethlehem. In Matthew, it appears that they've always lived in Nazareth or in Bethlehem, and they have to go to Nazareth to avoid the Herod daughter. Yeah.
I think kind of along those lines, it's important to remember who the audience that Matthew was writing to was. He's writing to Jews, right,
Yeah.
at the time, and so he And so much of this story is to fulfill what the prophet.
Yeah. And even the slaughter of the innocents. Well, it fulfills the prophet about Rachel weeping for her children, but they are no more. Out of Egypt I called my son. And you almost wonder how far Matthew is willing to push his story to find these scriptures, to find scripture fulfillment. I know, I shouldn't have said that, but that's it. Okay, other, yeah, Curtis?
I see how it's fulfilling the prophecy.
Yeah.
And sometimes unfortunate events are maybe not necessary,
Yeah.
but happen.
Yeah.
God foretold that. He didn't make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
He foretold that it would happen. And I always have seen this story as why we can't have nice things. Anytime something great happens, we have to mess it up.
Yeah.
And I think that's Herod, killing the
Yeah.
daughter and the children, and then killing Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, he was raised from the dead; it was necessary.
Yeah.
But another example.
Yeah.
We can't have nice things.
Yeah, and in fact, it's not just foreshadowing. All right, what else? What other king do we know who killed babies? Pharaoh. So in one, there's another sense in which, as we read this, and as a good Jew would read this, Herod is a new Pharaoh, and Jesus is a new Moses. So there's backward glances as well as forward glances.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine, well, unless there was another prophecy why another king would kill babies.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
like-
I hate to be in a room where people talk about killing babies.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I started it, so I mean, that's just, yeah.
It's just to prevent
Yeah.
something from coming to fruition.
Yeah.
And a change in power.
Yeah. So, but, I mean, like I say, Herod killed several of his sons and at least one of his wives for that very same reason. And apparently Bethlehem was only about 5 or 6 miles south of Jerusalem. And it's a very tiny place. So it does say Bethlehem in its environs that the babies were. Michael?
I'm struck by Joseph's obedience. Every time he receives a vision in a dream,
Yeah.
he reacts in obedience.
Yeah.
And he's taking his family on the road. They have these gifts probably to sustain him. Also, he's got a vocation that travels well.
Yeah.
In addition to that, but I think that Joseph is someone to be admired.
And what I didn't realize, and this would have been last week's lesson, there's no announcement to Mary in Matthew. The first thing we hear about Mary is she's pregnant, and we hear it about the same time Joseph hears it, and Joseph thinks the natural thing. Okay, I'm not going to be a bad guy here. I'll divorce her quietly, and nobody will know. And the angel comes to Joseph and says, that's not what you think. So Joseph is the main figure, like you were saying. Joseph is the main figure in the Matthew story, whereas Mary is the main figure in the Luke story.
Another thing, I guess, about Herod taking this message so seriously. I think for the Jews at the time, that would in a way give some legitimacy towards the story, because you have some royalty that thinks it's so important that they're going to wipe out such a significant portion, and which they're going to get, hopefully they'll get some pushback from that. I mean, it's terrible. I think in a way, it gives it some legitimacy to them, and the fact that he is going to be the king of the Jews.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of shows how impressive the Magi were. When they come to Herod and say, "Where is he who was born king of the Jews?" he takes them seriously. You know, he doesn't laugh them off. He doesn't have them killed. He says, okay, there's a problem out there for me. And I need, I'm taking this seriously. I'm taking this very seriously. So it's magnifies the importance of it. The telling magnifies, and the what the reactions you see. Okay. Any other thoughts?
We don't really have any knowledge of how the Magi come to know to ask for. the
No.
kingdom.
I mean, they're magi. They're magicians. They're astrologers. They look at the sky.
Just make that conclusion of
Right.
you see a star and there's a king to choose from. That's why
Yeah. Well, and some people will say, well, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter on 7 AD, 7 BC, and I mean, there's those kind of people out there that look for the next. Yeah, Curtis.
They said there was a prophet, right? There was a prophet, as was foretold by the prophet.
Yeah, there is a prophet. So is it Joel? Who is the prophet that? Micah, Joel. It's one of the minor prophets, and they actually quote it here. And in John, okay, in the Gospel of John, somebody says, well, Jesus is from Nazareth, and the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem, and he just leaves it. he never addresses that. And personally, I think that's an inside joke. John is looking at his audience, and they're saying, we know where he was born, and these guys don't. Because that exact issue comes up in the Gospel of John. They said, well, wait a minute, he's from Nazareth and the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem. And he just does not address it at all, just moves right on. That's why I say it's an inside joke, because Christians all know better by the time John was writing. Yeah, anyway, that's my interpretation of that one. All right, so think about all your other questions and ask David before the sermon. You get him all messed up. I was in a Toastmaster meeting yesterday in the Fallbrook Church, which is a mostly black church, and they had a almost life-size nativity scene inside their building that I took a picture of. So if you want to see a picture of a life-size nativity scene. But anyway, thank you for your attention and your questions. You helped teach me. We got past it anyway. Yeah, this is an interesting story. It's got lots of stuff in it. Bad ending. Okay. All right. I think we're gone.